It is now my real honor to embark on yet another really powerful conversation with a similarly committed, different kind of peacemaker, winner of the John Gardner Award, among many things, my friend and someone who I've admired for a very long time, Rosanne Haggerty, who is the founder and CEO of Community Solutions. And we'll hear a little bit more about her work, but it's really quite powerful to mine how she has both built trust in transformative work and drawn on profound values that have guided an evolution of that work that takes phenomenal courage, I think, especially when you're leading an organization. We're going to do that within the context today of the pandemic, COVID-19, and this racial reckoning moment that we're in. So Rosanne, welcome. It is great to be with you as always.
Well, Dan, thank you for having me. And what a privilege to listen to Lima. I think that image of the dripping sponge is going to be with me forever.
Yeah, I would agree. We've had this wonderful initiative, and each of these women, like yourself, have just dedicated their lives, and it's a privilege to hear them, to be part of their world, and to have them be a part of ours. So as I always like to start these conversations, I'd love to hear kind of a little bit about your background, and particularly what it is you draw on that has kind of brought you into this work, and most importantly, what sustains you in this work.
Well, I grew up in a suburb of Hartford, Connecticut, in a family where my parents were very animated by Catholic social teaching. So this notion of the dignity of every person and the preferential option for the poor and solidarity. I think they weren't just concepts. We watched, my brothers and sisters and I, our parents kind of lived that out. We thought we were oddballs, but I mean, those models last a lifetime. We would go to Mass in downtown Hartford, and our parents would kind of herd us over to some of these boarding houses and single room occupancy hotels in downtown Hartford to check in on these elderly people living alone. And so when I think, when people ask, how did you get involved with housing? I said, I think it really dates to that, but that was a very powerful set of values that still are the ones I find myself drawing on as a system of thought for leading an ethical life. I think our approach to homelessness and the fact that this has been sort of the driving project of my life is very related to that.
So just it's interesting, the parallel we heard from Lema of this profound sense of faith animating, and I hear it again in your story. Just for the folks that may not be as familiar with Catholic social teaching, you and I share a passion for this. We can do this together if it's helpful, but I'd love, you mentioned three very powerful terms, preferential option for the poor, solidarity, and there was a third, I want to say
the dignity of each life.
Right. I always think of subsidiarity, which is not what you talked about.
And that is the other. So
yeah.
Another important one.
Talk just briefly about what those mean for you.
Well, that you leave no one behind, that you start with the most vulnerable when you're looking to understand and unpack a problem, and that you do the work with others, that there are no transformational efforts that are solo shows. So I think that those are some of the principles that just are the screens for the way I think about whatever it is to be done. So
yeah,
I don't always live up to it, but at least that calls me back, those ideas.
So let's talk a little bit. One of the things that I have found among a number of things profound is where you started in your work and this passion for housing, and then kind of how it evolved. So, and I see those principles being kind of brought to life in different ways over the course of years. So talk a little bit about where Community Solutions started and kind of what your aspiration is now.
Well, what's interesting, Dan, is I feel as though my adulthood and my time in this work on homelessness very much matches sort of the arc of this issue. When I got out of college and volunteered for a year at a shelter for runaway and homeless young people, it was a moment when homelessness was just sort of recently in the early 80s just being identified as an issue, and the shape of it had changed. More and more people experiencing mental health problems, and more women. Just the numbers were growing, and it was possible at that time to really believe, oh my gosh, there's this surge of an unthinkable problem. How do we get ourselves organized to end it, to solve it? And yet, in working at this shelter, it was very quickly clear that, while the intentions were wonderful, it was totally mismatched to the nature of the problem, and we were simply putting a Band-Aid on something. And so that was a catalyst for my going into developing affordable housing and going to work for a not-for-profit in New York to learn how to do that. And then I ended up starting my own not-for-profit, an organization called Common Ground, around preserving some of these, at that point, old SRO hotels and buildings that were essentially being turned over and becoming, upscale housing, or just weren't recognized as the important places of housing for low-income individuals. And so we were at very good work for the 20 years I led that organization, but it became increasingly clear, I would say, within the first 7 years, when we built a few, at that point, made over 1,000 small apartments in the center of Manhattan, that whatever kind of magical thinking had guided the notion that, like, we build it, then it gets all sorted out. We were building more housing, and there was more homelessness. And so there was this other moment of reckoning, like, wait a minute, like, who actually has that ball? How, it wasn't shelter, that was an incomplete solution. It wasn't housing. That somehow we had to rethink what was going on. And I really, it was a pretty important moment to realize that we weren't going to learn what was going on if we didn't start talking to people on the street themselves and understand the problem from their perspective. And that was the beginning of what is now Community Solutions. We ended up creating a new organization to connect the dots, to help communities actually put a full, what we even refer to as a command center, in place. All of the individuals who touch on the issue in a given community, to drive toward a population level solution, to really understand person by person in real time who's experiencing homelessness and why and how does that problem get resolved at the individual level, but to really put the resources together that all of these different efforts, organizations have, in order to get everyone out of homelessness, to make this an issue that is actually in the solvable bucket now. We at Built for Zero, the national network of communities with whom we're working in this way, a dozen communities have ended chronic or veteran homelessness. More than 40 are reducing homelessness. And it's really about this story of moving from kind of individual or like emergency responses to good individual programs, to really trying to grapple with the whole and understand homelessness as, well, two things. One, a complex problem, not just about unlucky individuals. Basically, it's about a broken system, of which vulnerable people are the victim. But also as seeing homelessness as a symptom of the problem of all of the fragmentation in our public health and social support systems, and a very powerful bellwether for what's working or not in our intentions to create communities that work for everyone and that are equitable and that do not leave people behind.
Mm-hmm. So a lot there. Just a couple things I want to highlight, and I want to go to a question. One is a journey from direct service, to your point, to a scaled single solution, excellent organization, excellent at building housing, to an aha around problem solving that required a completely different way of proceeding in collective action. Secondly, there's a sense that the very nature of homelessness went to a problem that could be solved, to a system a symptom of a whole system that needed to be rethought, both in terms of how we provided services and why homelessness was in fact a problem in the way our society organized resources and made decisions. Is that a fair summary?
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you, Dan. And that's actually where we are now. And I think you're probably about to ask me, isn't this relevant to lots of other issues? Absolutely. So, mhm.
So I'm going to go there. I want to ask one antecedent question, which is, so what, those are three major life transitions as a leader, from direct service to now really, so in a shelter with people in a very kind of human one-on-one, to building an organization, a really well-run rockstar organization in its own right. So all that's entailed in doing that, to all of a sudden pivoting yet again to thinking categorically differently. So help us understand what enables you to make those transitions and where you get stuck. We all get stuck. Sometimes we get permanently stuck, but where are your Velcro-y moments in that?
I think one of the things that keeps me honest and continuing to ask what happens next is it still breaks my heart to see a person on the street and to know it doesn't need to be that way. And I know it's needed. I know I want to be able to take that person to a place that is safe and where they'll be treated with dignity, and what they need to get out of that situation is going to be, available, and that there's going to be cooperation and there's going to be respect. And so it's one of these issues that is so visible. It's such a constant reminder that in our case, we now see these communities that are showing a path to ending homelessness. So what keeps me honest and uncomfortable is continuing to see people experiencing homelessness and know that's not the world I want to be living in. And I have to say, it is also my ability to keep asking different questions is so completely supported by a team that is very much made of that same energy and brings very powerful values about how we just keep learning, and that's the posture I think that we support each other in, that we've just sort of embraced learning, and part of that is understanding and embracing the use of data, that we are very convinced that without knowing how a whole community is doing on this issue, as well as knowing specifically by name who's experiencing the problem and why and how and why they're getting stuck in that situation, that if you don't have that information, you can't solve the problem. And so the idea that you need that kind of information, and you need constantly to be in learning mode and testing mode, and that there is no just declaring victory when there's always more to be learning. And we have now, with these amazing community leaders, I think been hugely effective, and the work is being done locally. And I'll say a bit about the role that we play, but that what's powerful about this Built for Zero moment is that we now have such a large network of community leaders who have embraced this kind of fearless learning driven by data, and that is a powerful new kind of common language about what's real in their community, and that is highlighting what's working, what isn't, where they need to go next, how they make smart investments, and how they just embrace a new process for problem solving.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm just going to link back to something you said at the very beginning: preferential option for the poor, staying connected. And another one of your fellow Gardner Award winners, Brian Stevenson, who talks about proximity, which is very similar. But it felt like that is the energy in this, that you remain connected to folks like that, and that are struggling, and that is a fuel that drives your work forward. So let's I want to bring in a theme that we're talking about today, trust. And you have really been one of the leaders in the country in civil society that modeled a shift from organizational excellence to problem solving.
Mhm.
And in order for that to happen, especially when, to your point, systems are as broken as they are, it requires multiple actors, and it requires
Mhm.
both kind of a force of personality at times and a kind of humanity to engage folks that actually are of goodwill, that may not be seeing how they're operating as part of the problem rather than what they think is part of the solution. So how does trust work in your work, particularly when you start talking about this kind of movement building,
Mhm.
um, system solving work?
Right. Well, we've been referred to, and I think it's an interesting term, as a field catalyst, as a different kind of
Mm,
intermediary. And to define that, and this is a group from Bridgespan that articulated this, groups that are essentially seeking to solve a problem at a population level, that are about sort of helping to organize the activities of others in more effective, connected ways, we're really focused on outcomes and on a change that we see as possible, and not on consensus or on just reacting, but with a real vision for change. And they also say built to win, not to last. But and I think that's true. I think we'll keep evolving, to the extent, the problem remains and we're needed. But what we've also learned in playing this role in homelessness, and helping to organize this, network now of 81 cities and counties in this country, and parallel efforts in other countries, which is exciting. But that there's a real hunger for, I think, some truth telling, which is all of the big problems we've got are complex problems that are not going to be solved by one organization or one idea in one space. And that this notion of building a trusted network of people who are learning in public, I think, we are very mindful of the work being done by the communities. We're supporting them. We're providing the data systems and the coaching and the benchmarking, and helping things get unstuck, and advising and occasionally assisting in developing housing in that last mile. But it really is about the communities, and we don't have a project. We don't have a path forward. None of the communities do locally if groups don't trust each other, because they're working together in new ways. No one is forcing them to work together with communities across the country. No one's forcing them to work with us. It's very much a trust network of people who are sharing a vision that is transcending all of our ability to accomplish this work on our own.
so let's go to something we heard a little bit of community where folks are struggling. And how do you build trust? So, let's just, we're both white privileged leaders.
Mhm.
Many of the communities where there is really difficult homelessness, disproportionately folks of color who have been in cycles of poverty or have been really tossed out by the system. So they haven't seen a lot of there's a lot of distrust for anybody that comes from elite institutions, particularly white-led institutions. How do you bridge that gap?
Well, it's a constant process, and you only bridge it by showing up and listening and doing the work authentically. Um, we are very much in, the business ourselves of looking to deepen our own learning internally, of increasing the the training levels of our team in terms of how to engage these conversations, of diversifying our own team, and leadership at every level. Uh, we rely a lot on community leaders and on other leaders in the sector um, to really guide us. I'd say one of the areas that has been powerful, and I think is a contribution our team has been able to make to this conversation, and is very much focused on and expanding, is how communities can understand what's real in their communities with respect to how homelessness and those experiences that feed into homelessness are landing very disproportionately on Black and Native Americans. On the one hand, it's been evident forever. When I was working back at that shelter in the early 80s, the vast majority of the young people who were there were Black young men from central Brooklyn and the Bronx. And that's still it's still the case, shamefully, all over the country, that those experiencing homelessness are very disproportionately Black and Native American. So there's nothing new here. But what is new, and I think is so powerful in this moment, is this commitment to really examine like what is creating all of this, and not simply being reacting. We've been working on with our community teams on building a racially equitable homeless response system, which is helping communities pull apart the data on who is experiencing homelessness and why, the causal factors, what systems upstream, the criminal justice system, healthcare, need to be engaged differently. Where can the data help communities see the relationship between racist housing policies and homelessness? So our particular commitment is, how do we help undo systemic racism that is manifest in homelessness through helping communities find the path through using their data about what specifically needs to change. Now that has to be in the context of a huge shift in minds and hearts, but there's something very powerful we've seen in just having the evidence of what is causing this to be happening and knowing where to go next to undo the systemic racism.
Yeah. So how, we live in an area where facts are disputed.
Mm-hmm.
So how does the evidence, the data help navigate trust? And you said something earlier that you're not so much built to last as built to win. And so it strikes me that is a posture of saying, we'll follow the data, we'll do whatever it takes to further solutions. And that's also got to have conflict in it. Yeah. So building trust, navigating conflict, holding facts that are agreed upon and become the touchstone where people can all say, yes, we all agree this is true, and now what do we want to do about it? That's tough stuff. Well,
you've just really outlined, I think, the daily kind of conflict challenge, of my life, which is, truth and unity, believing ultimately, we have to see ourselves as connected. But I like to start with an invitation rather than a demand. But one of the things about the way communities that we're working with actually understand who's experiencing homelessness is, like, we don't give them a printout of here's what is coming from the homeless services agencies. Communities create this data themselves. We work with communities to create what we call a quality by name list checklist. Your data has to be well enough organized to account for everyone, to be able to be updated as dynamically as the problem shifts and changes, and to now break down who's experiencing homelessness in terms of disaggregating by race. But it's communities who actually do the work of sitting around those tables and making sure they're accounting for everyone. And there is, I've seen it so many times, and it's one of the great thrills and transformational moments where communities have come back from going out and doing these outreach projects or just working through their data until the point where they feel as though they've accounted for everyone, and all of a sudden this isn't some big anonymous problem that it's intractable until there's enough affordable housing or until there's this or that. They're like, we now know everyone's name, and these are people again. And that in itself, they've collected the data and they've accounted for their neighbors by name. And there's this different kind of energy that goes with that. But there's also, this is an experience of trust building, this isn't someone who said, here's what you've got to do and here's who you have to do it for. It's that, co-creation with other organizations in the community of what's true, creates this new this new paradigm, really, of these are specific problems encountered by vulnerable neighbors, and we all agree on that being the case.
So trust is grounded in part in relationship, in a sense that there is a shared experience that's agreed upon that allows folks then to operate differently.
Yeah, very, very much the case. And I'm so glad you basically boiled it all down to that, relationship. It's about, the real interactions, showing up and doing the work consistently, but also being part of a process that we're part of with all of these communities, of regularly changing course in response to, is what we're doing working? Are we getting to the outcomes that we want? Are we getting to that end state of there is no regular homelessness in our community, where homelessness is rare? If someone has a housing crisis, it's quickly resolved. And that shared commitment is really about entering into new relationships with each other that are not transactional. It's really around a shared vision of the kind of community they want to be.
That's great. We have some questions rolling in, so I'm going to give you one, and if other folks on the line want to ask questions, now would be the time. The first question we have is, where do you go to get community homelessness models? And can you identify some that you would point folks to?
Yeah, well, what I might do is highlight some of the communities we're working with that are that have already gotten to zero chronic or veteran homelessness as places that have developed their own models. I mean, there's some truisms throughout this work, like housing first is just not to make housing conditional. That should be your starting point. That housing is a better investment than shelter. If you can subsidize someone's rent to keep them from becoming homeless, that's always the best course of action. That housing and health are very inextricably linked. That's a truism. But in places like Bergen County, New Jersey, right across the river from New York City, or Montgomery County, Maryland, or Arlington, Virginia, not far from where you're sitting, Dan. These are all places that have ended chronic and or veteran homelessness. And what you'll find is that they have done any number of things, and they keep changing up what they're doing to keep this problem solved. One of the common approaches is to engage the private sector landlords to really think about the whole community and the assets there that can be deployed to provide sources of housing or support. All of these communities are using this very dynamic kind of approach to, like, we're going to meet however often we need to meet as a team every week to make sure that everyone on our by name list is being matched to housing as quickly as we possibly can make that happen, and to keep looking upstream to, like, if new people are becoming homeless, what's causing that to happen. And so the communities like Arlington and Montgomery, or like Jacksonville, Florida, is doing amazing work, pushing toward the end of veteran homelessness. And what you see those communities doing is always, just continuing to refine their work and looking more and more upstream to how to prevent the incidence of new homelessness. And that may be different in every community. And I think that's one of the big learnings of our work over these years, that there's a very consistent structure around a shared goal that is across the population of a community, the team, by name, real-time data, and constant iteration to see what it's going to take to get to zero. But what you might do in Bergen County, create some incentive program or a landlord fund, might be very different from what you would do in Montgomery County, which might mean going to the local housing authority and negotiating a set aside of units. So the structure turns out to be more important than a specific successful interventions that happen to work in their particular context. But one of the things I will say about Built for Zero is that we're always kind of doing mini case studies of what is working in different communities, and making that library available to other communities to give them maybe a starting point idea for adaptation locally.
Yeah, super powerful. We have a number of questions. One very, I think, easy. Are there any examples or any communities you have in Chicago, a part of your network?
We are working with Lake County, which is Waukegan, just north of Chicago, and with Rockford, Illinois, northeast of Chicago, and both communities are amazing. Rockford has ended chronic and veteran homelessness. Waukegan has ended veteran homelessness. We don't work with the city of Chicago, but we know that there is some good work going on there. But I couldn't tell you more about it, I'm afraid.
Oh, no, it's fine. And I think people may want to follow up with you. Another question came in, and then I want to follow up on this, your last kind of overview there. How would you suggest we look upstream for the mass evictions that are poised to happen?
Yeah.
And what are a few of the first steps to ready ourselves for that?
This is such a critical question at this moment. I mean, everything we know about the horrendous personal and health and other costs of homelessness, we have a moment in time now to spare millions of Americans from that experience. There could be, based on economists' projections recently, as much as a 40 to 45% increase in homelessness, and that's just based on histories of employment and how that triggers homelessness. So, this is the time to intervene. It's stunning. And so the most important thing everyone can do is push the Senate to pass what's called the HEROES Act. It's the next stimulus bill. There's $100 billion that is in that act, supported by landlord and tenant groups around the country to provide emergency and some longer term rental assistance. You need a program of that magnitude to match the magnitude of the risk right now.
I see.
And everything we know, and like a bazillion cost studies, done all over the country, internationally, show that if you invest money in helping people to hang on to their homes, it is by far the smartest investment in terms of cost savings to the public and avoided trauma and misery and costs that show up in all sorts of ways, frankly, over a generation or more. So this is a really, really important moment for the country to step up and deal with this dire threat of new mass homelessness.
That's great. We at Independent Sector, as you well know, are also working tirelessly on the HEROES Act, and we'll join in that. I wanted to go back to something that you said that I thought was extraordinarily powerful. What I heard you say is, look, we have kind of a methodology that when a community invites us to share that methodology, we can bring, 30, 40 years of wisdom into the do's and don'ts of how that methodology can come to life. But at the end of the day, the community will have to tailor it to its particular set of needs. So that's in and of itself powerful in the sense, I came out of the era, as you well know, of the school reform where you dropped in the playbook and it was supposed to solve all the problems. And I think we're seeing this wonderful recognition that local agency, subsidiarity actually does matter.
Very, very true. And I think in some ways you've offered a definition of trust.
I go to a deeper question, and that is, just froze on me. Be back. Sorry, I froze. My internet is, for whatever reason, acting up today. But the question I wanted to raise with you was about community conversion. You have to, because it isn't just the invitation, it's the disposition over time that if people take their eyes off the prize, the problem creeps back in. How do you keep that alive in a community?
And that is the big long-term vision, not just to reach zero, but sustain it, and to actually shift norms so that the idea of vulnerable people in our community becoming homeless and remaining homeless is just something that we all reject and can hold hold our leaders accountable toward. And the moment we're in now, where we have all awoken to just how desperately underfunded, under capacity, and broken our public health infrastructure is. Well, we've been seeing for years that homelessness is this orphan issue. It's kind of got tucked over at HUD, but it's a health issue. And the kinds of public health like strategies that have transformed the conditions of life and solved for different diseases from which we can now be protected, that those disciplines of collaboration, data, person specificity, I mean, it's ringing a bell. We have learned so much inadvertently and now very intentionally about how you problem solve complex problems that have a public health nature. So our vision is, as the nation must invest and rebuild a public health infrastructure to protect us all, we can design homelessness out of existence. It can be one of those issues. We already see what it takes to solve it, that local discipline, local coordination, having the right information, preventing problems from happening, having a good enough data system that when people first call for help with a housing need, that help is delivered effectively, that actually can be a feature of a rock solid public health system that we can all trust going forward.
So first of all, I have one last question for you. I just want to thank you. It is always just kind of a personal delight to get to spend time with you for so many reasons. One of the things I think a lot about in my own life now, and I'm always curious for someone else, is if you could go back to that younger, idealistic woman working in the shelter and impart some wisdom to her about how to journey forward, maybe more quickly or with a kind of clarity, the wisdom that would help her move to this kind of loving, constructive posture that you have. What would you impart with her on?
It would be trust yourself and what you're seeing. I have gone through this thought exercise myself at times, Dan, and realized everything that we see as sort of explosively true now about how homelessness is really an issue of racial justice, of homelessness is really an issue of systems that are disconnected and broken, of no accountability. I remember myself as a 21-year-old thinking all of those things, like, why is this the case? Why is this the case? Why is this the case? And yet being in an atmosphere where kind of everyone was like, well, this is the way it is. And it's that I've had to unlearn and kind of get back to the mind space of my 21-year-old self.
Huh. It's interesting as we think about this moment in time where young people are leading so much of the energy and the demand for social change. It's really wise words and now we as adults who are old have to pay attention to, I think, in a way that may be uncomfortable at times. Thank you so much, Rosanne. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for the friendship. Thank you for your willingness to share your hard-won wisdom. And I look forward to continuing our conversations.
Well, Dan, this has been a delight. Thank you.